The lights burned hot against the stage as the debate reached its boiling point. Cameras locked in, microphones buzzed, and a restless crowd leaned forward, waiting for the next verbal strike. Then it happened. Jordan Peterson leaned toward his mic, his voice sharpened like a blade. With an almost theatrical pause, he declared that Jasmine Crockett was unfit to serve. The word hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Gasps scattered through the audience. Some shook their heads. Others smirked with satisfaction. The cameras caught every reaction, from the narrowed eyes of Crockett's supporters to the smug satisfaction playing across Peterson's face. He sat back, folding his hands, confident that he had landed the final blow. But the room was unsettled. Murmurs spread like a wave. Was this simply another insult from a man known for his dismissive critiques, or had he just crossed a line too far? The tension was more than political. It was cultural, generational, and deeply personal. Viewers at home felt it instantly. Fingers flying across keyboards, timelines exploding with outrage and disbelief. Did he really just say that? The question pulsed across the digital sphere, multiplying by the second. On stage, Crockett did not flinch. Her eyes locked on Peterson, calm but unyielding, as if she had heard this very line 100 times before in 100 different rooms. Unfit! It was the word so many had weaponized against women, against people of color, against anyone who dared challenge the hierarchy of voices in power. And yet, instead of crumbling beneath the insult, Crockett's stillness became its own quiet defiance. Every lens zoomed in on her face, searching for a crack, a stumble, a sign of weakness. None came. Instead, the tension deepened. The audience, whether in the room or behind screens, sensed something they couldn't yet name. Crockett wasn't simply enduring the insult. She was holding back, waiting, building towards something, because she knew what Peterson, and perhaps the nation, didn't. Words like unfit could only sting if they were allowed to linger uncontested. And she had carried into that room a weapon of truth powerful enough to turn the insult back on its source. But Crockett had come prepared. And what she revealed next silenced the room. The word unfit was not new. It was a familiar blade, sharpened by history and wielded against anyone who did not fit the mold of power. For Jasmine Crockett, it was more than an insult. It was a reminder of the centuries in which women, especially women of color, were told to know their place, to shrink their presence, to quiet their voices. And in that moment, the clash between her and Jordan Peterson became something much larger than two individuals at a debate table. It became a confrontation between two visions of America. On one side stood Peterson, a figure celebrated by his admirers as an intellectual truth-teller, but criticized by many for dismissing social justice as overreach, for belittling movements that gave voice to the marginalized. His legacy was built on contrarian commentary, lines that cut deep into cultural debates about gender, identity, and equality. To his followers, his words were clarion calls of reason. To his critics, they were dismissals of lived experience, cloaked in academic tone. On the other side stood Crockett, a rising voice in Congress whose career was built not in lecture halls, but in courtrooms and neighborhoods. She carried the struggles of ordinary people into the chambers of power. She spoke for communities that had too often been overlooked, dismissed, or outright attacked. Her presence in Congress was itself a disruption of the status quo. An immigrant's daughter, a black woman, a fighter who did not come to Washington to be silent. The tension between them was more than personal. It was generational, cultural, ideological. When Peterson called her unfit, he was echoing an old narrative that America has wrestled with since its founding. Who gets to define fitness? Who gets to hold power? And who gets to be silenced? The crowd understood this instantly, even if only subconsciously. They weren't just hearing an insult. They were watching history repeat itself on a brightly lit stage, and that is why the moment mattered so much. In Crockett's calm, there was an unspoken defiance. In Peterson's certainty, there was the weight of arrogance that had too often gone unchecked. The debate had become a proxy for the national divide. Tradition versus change, exclusion versus inclusion, arrogance versus dignity. Social media captured the divide in real time. Supporters of Peterson rushed to praise his candor. But the surge of Crockett's defenders was louder, fueled by outrage and solidarity. They saw in her the embodiment of a fight they had lived themselves, the struggle to prove worth in rooms where the odds were stacked against them. The stakes could not have been higher. To the progressive audience watching, this was no longer about whether one comment would land or not. It was about whether dignity could withstand insult, whether truth could outlast arrogance. Crockett's every pause, every measured breath, became a rallying point. And Peterson, certain that his words had landed, seemed unaware that the stage beneath him was shifting. Because when a person has built their legacy on rhetoric alone, the moment someone introduces undeniable evidence, the ground gives way, and yet the story of how these two paths collided begins long before that night. Long before the cameras fixated on his sharp declaration that Jasmine Crockett was unfit, Jordan Peterson had been building a reputation that made such words sting with amplified force. He had not emerged from obscurity as a typical pundit or politician. His roots were in academia, in the quiet halls of psychology departments where he once lectured on meaning, myth, and the human mind. In those early years, Peterson was not a household name. He was a professor who fascinated students with his ability to weave together philosophy, psychology, and cultural history. He could take the most complex ideas and bend them into compelling, if sometimes intimidating, lectures. But the quiet professor did not remain quiet. His leap into international fame began not with research, but with confrontation. He chose a battle that would catapult him into the public eye, opposing the expansion of gender identity protections in Canada. His defiance, framed as a defense of free speech, ignited a storm. Suddenly, he was no longer just Dr. Peterson. He was a cultural lightning rod. Television studios, podcasts, and YouTube channels scrambled to feature him. His books shot up bestseller lists. Clips of him debating students or clashing with interviewers went viral. To his admirers, he became a prophet of responsibility, a voice reminding a generation to clean their room, to take control of their lives, to resist what he painted as chaos creeping in through political correctness. To his detractors, he was something else entirely, a man dressing arrogance in the robes of intellectualism, dismissing the marginalized while claiming to defend universal truths. This contradiction was at the core of Peterson's appeal, and his flaw. He positioned himself as a champion of discipline and humility, yet often displayed little of either when confronted. He urged young men to listen, to take accountability. But when critics pressed him on the human cost of his rhetoric, he brushed them aside with cutting disdain. Clips of him laughing off questions about systemic inequality or mocking terms like social justice became rallying points for his fan base. What some heard as clarity, others recognized as cruelty. And yet, his power was undeniable. Crowds filled theaters to hear him speak. His followers described him in near-spiritual terms, claiming his guidance saved their lives, rescued them from nihilism, or gave them purpose. His opponents saw a different figure, one who had mastered the art of intellectual theater, building, a brand not on solutions, but on stoking division. Time and again, Peterson showcased a certain arrogance in public exchanges. When interviewers challenged him, he smirked, leaned back, and delivered lines meant to humiliate rather than enlighten. He relished turning questions back on his challengers, weaponizing his command of language to corner them. For his supporters, these moments proved his genius. For his critics, they revealed a man more interested in winning than in listening. This duality made him formidable. He was not a caricature easily dismissed. He was a force, sharp-tongued, clever, and relentless. And when he turned that force against Jasmine Crockett, labeling her unfit, it carried the weight of a career spent dismantling opponents on live stages. That was the persona he cultivated, the intellectual warrior who never yielded, who could not be outmaneuvered. But even the strongest persona has cracks. Peterson, in his rise, became increasingly predictable. He wielded the same dismissals again and again, emotional, uninformed, ideologically possessed. His critics noted that for all his rhetoric about responsibility, he rarely extended it to himself. He had mastered the pose of certainty, but behind that certainty was a refusal to admit fallibility. For an audience weary of arrogance disguised as authority, Peterson symbolized the very obstacle they had long faced. The man at the podium, speaking over voices like Crockett's, assuming the mantle of truth without ever granting legitimacy to perspectives outside his own. That was why his words, though familiar, still cut deep. He was not just another detractor, he was the embodiment of a larger pattern. In the debate chamber, that reputation loomed like a shadow. Every viewer who knew his history felt the weight of it. To defeat Peterson in such a moment seemed nearly impossible. His presence carried the intimidation of years spent conquering conversations. He looked untouchable, like a figure too entrenched in influence to ever be undone. But if Peterson seemed untouchable, Crockett's journey told a different story. Long before the cameras found her on the national stage, Jasmine Crockett's story began far from the bright lights of Washington. Hers was not the path of privilege, nor of the polished insider who inherits influence. She grew up in the grit of real communities where survival meant resilience, and where people learned to fight for dignity, not because it was fashionable, but because it was necessary. From a young age, she carried with her a sense of justice sharpened by experience. An instinct that the rules were not always written for everyone, and that silence was never the answer. Law became her weapon of choice. While others chased lucrative firms and corner offices, Crockett set her sights on the streets where injustice lived. She entered courtrooms not to defend corporations, but to defend people. Tenants against landlords, workers against exploitation, citizens against systems, tilted against them. In these fights, she built her reputation as a lawyer who did not back down, even when the odds screamed that she should. She argued with the fire of someone who knew what was at stake was not just a verdict, but a person's life and future. Her civil rights advocacy deepened her resolve. Cases that others avoided, messy, politically dangerous, or simply too hard, Crockett embraced. She represented protesters, immigrants, and ordinary people entangled in machinery too big for them to fight alone. In these moments, she discovered not just her voice, but her mission. To speak when others were silenced, to stand where others had been pushed aside. But with every victory came a new wave of resistance. From the beginning, Crockett was underestimated. Her critics saw her as too young, too outspoken, too bold for her place. They whispered that she didn't belong, that her background was a weakness, not a strength. And when whispering failed, to slow her, the attacks became louder, more personal. They called her angry, radical, unfit. Each insult carried the weight of stereotypes weaponized against women like her, against black leaders who refused to conform, against anyone who dared to disrupt the balance of power. Yet Crockett never shrank. She learned early that to be underestimated was not a curse, but a cloak of invisibility she could wield. While they mocked her, she organized. While they doubted her, she strategized. While they dismissed her, she built alliances with communities who saw in her what they had longed for, someone who did not speak at them, but for them and with them. She was not a polished figure sculpted by think tanks. She was the people's fighter. Her rise into Congress was not an accident. It was the culmination of years spent earning trust in courtrooms, on sidewalks, and in rallies where she stood shoulder to shoulder with those demanding to be heard. In her election night speech, she did not speak of personal triumph, but of collective power. "This victory," she said, "is not mine alone. It belongs to every person who has been told they are too small to matter." And yet, stepping into Washington did not soften her battles, it intensified them. In those hallowed halls, Crockett carried with her the same fire that had carried her through courtrooms. She did not hide her identity, she wore it as armor. Still, she was met with the familiar chorus of doubt. Established figures questioned her experience. Commentators mocked her style. Opponents tried to frame her passion as recklessness. But every attempt to box her in only deepened her resolve to break through. This is why Peterson's insult, the branding of unfit, resonated so strongly. For Crockett, it was not the first time, and it would not be the last. But the difference, that night was not the insult itself. It was what she had prepared in anticipation of it. Because Crockett understood the rhythm of these encounters, she knew Peterson's reputation, his habit of belittling, the way he wielded words as weapons. She anticipated the strike, and instead of arriving unarmed, she came with evidence that would not only shield her, but expose him. And it was not just any evidence. It was a recording, a carefully preserved piece of truth that cut through rhetoric like steel through paper. Crockett had chosen to hold it, to wait for the moment when the insult came, because she understood that timing was as important as substance. The right truth, unleashed at the right time, could undo even the strongest opponent. Her journey, from grassroots battles to the heart of Congress, had taught her this: power respects spectacle. To challenge arrogance on its own stage, she needed more than principle. She needed proof, delivered with the precision of a strike. That night, she carried with her more than years of advocacy, more than the weight of her community's faith. She carried the moment of reckoning, and it was one decision, one recording, that would become her ultimate shield. The stage lights grew hotter as the debate wore on, the air charged with a tension that felt almost electric. What began as a spirited exchange quickly evolved into a clash of philosophies, egos, and identities. Jordan Peterson leaned forward, his voice clipped with disdain, as if every word he spoke was a scalpel meant to slice through his opponent's credibility. "She is unfit," he repeated, stressing the word until it echoed in the auditorium. "Unfit to represent, unfit to lead, unfit to be taken seriously." The repetition carried with it not only insult, but finality, as though Peterson believed the sheer force of his authority could cement the judgment. The audience bristled. Some gasped, others applauded. The cameras caught every reaction, the clenched jaws, the fists curled in anger, the satisfied nods from those who saw his words as validation. Peterson, sensing momentum, pressed further. "She is uninformed," he continued, waving a dismissive hand as if brushing aside an inconvenience. "She comes here armed with emotion, not intellect. It's the same problem we face again and again. Grandstanding, not governance." His voice rose, sharp with conviction, as though he had found the perfect formula: belittle, diminish, and dominate. But Jasmine Crockett did not take the bait. She sat in stillness, her gaze fixed, her posture unshaken. The storm gathered around, her thunderous and blinding, but she remained like stone, unyielding, steady, impossible to move. Every insult hurled her way only made her silence louder. The audience watching began to notice the imbalance. One man's voice raged, while one woman's calm absorbed it all, refusing to shatter. Peterson, however, mistook silence for weakness. He leaned back with a smirk, then lunged again, his words sharp and cutting. "You're emotional," he said, drawing out the syllables with deliberate scorn. "That's the problem. Emotional reactions don't solve crises. Emotional politicians don't create solutions, they create chaos." He punctuated the line with a dismissive shrug, confident that he had once again reduced her to a stereotype. The room grew taut with expectation. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens, waiting for Crockett to lash out, to meet fire with fire. But she didn't. Instead, she offered the faintest of smiles, the kind that unnerved more than a shout ever could. Her restraint was not weakness, it was strategy. She understood that in debates like these, composure was more powerful than rage. Whispers spread through the crowd. Who would break first? Could Crockett endure the barrage without faltering, or would Peterson's relentless strikes chip away at her resolve? The audience felt suspended, caught in the gravity of a duel where each pause carried more weight than the words themselves. Peterson, reveling in the sound of his own dominance, mistook the audience's tension for victory. He launched into yet another line, repeating "unfit" as though stamping a brand onto his opponent. His voice boomed, filling every corner of the auditorium, drowning out even the murmurs. And still, Crockett remained unmoved. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to signal that she was not cowed, not silenced, but waiting. Waiting for something Peterson could not yet see. Because the truth was, Crockett had come prepared for this very moment. The insults did not surprise her. They were echoes of every battle she had fought in courtrooms, in campaigns, in Congress. She knew the language of dismissal all too well, and she also knew the most devastating counterstrike was never to meet insult with insult, but to meet arrogance with undeniable truth. The crowd shifted, sensing it too, the energy around Crockett, the quiet power that seemed to grow with each attack she absorbed. Peterson was the storm, loud and relentless. She was the stone, immovable and enduring. And in the contrast, the imbalance of power was slowly reversing, though he was blind to it, because Crockett had not yet shown her hand. She had not unleashed the weapon she carried, the truth she had guarded, the evidence that could shift the entire debate in a single instant. But Crockett hadn't shown her hand yet. That's when she reached for the recording. For a long, charged moment, it seemed as if the debate had reached its peak. Peterson towering in his certainty, Crockett weathering the storm with her unshakable calm. The audience buzzed with expectation, caught in the pull of a confrontation that felt destined to end with one voice silenced. And then, without raising her tone, without matching insult with insult, Jasmine Crockett leaned toward her microphone and changed everything. Her words were measured, her tone almost disarmingly soft. "You keep calling me unfit, uninformed, emotional," she said, pausing deliberately. The stillness of her voice stood in sharp contrast to the thunder of Peterson's accusations. "But words are one thing, and proof is another." The air tightened. People shifted in their seats. The moderators leaned forward, sensing a turn but not yet sure what was coming. Crockett reached into her folder, her movements unhurried, deliberate, and pulled out a small device. She placed it on the table in front of her, her hand steady, as if she were setting down a final piece on a chessboard. "What I have here," she continued, "isn't speculation. It isn't emotion. It's your own words." Gasps broke through the silence. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail. The device, the firmness of her gaze, the sudden flicker of unease across Peterson's face. His eyes narrowed, his posture stiffened, as though he sensed the ground beneath him had just shifted. For once, the man who thrived on verbal sparring found himself staring down a weapon he could not out-talk. Crockett pressed play. A crackle of audio filled the auditorium, followed by the unmistakable cadence of Jordan Peterson's own voice. The recording played him dismissing the very values he so often championed, mocking young men who had taken his advice too literally, admitting behind closed doors that responsibility is a useful slogan, not a lifestyle, and brushing aside the struggles of communities he claimed to support. His words, sharp and unfiltered, stripped away the intellectual armor he wore so carefully in public. The audience froze. Some mouths fell open. others covered in shock. The contradictions were undeniable. The man who built his empire on responsibility casually belittled it as a tool of branding. The figure who claimed to defend ordinary people dismissed them when the cameras weren't rolling. Every second of the recording cut deeper, unraveling the carefully crafted persona he had carried into the room. Peterson shifted in his chair. He tried to smirk, tried to compose himself, but his confidence wavered. His hand tugged at his sleeve. His lips parted as if to interject, but no words came. Each time he leaned toward his microphone, the next damning line of the recording landed, pinning him in place. The crowd erupted into whispers and gasps, the kind of collective sound that sweeps through a room when people realize they are witnessing history in real time. Phones shot up, screens glowing as audience members recorded not just the playback, but Peterson's unraveling face. Social media lit up within seconds. Hashtags formed mid-broadcast. Crockett clapback. Peterson exposed. Receipts ready. The clips spread at the speed of outrage. And yet, through the storm of reaction, Crockett remained composed. She did not gloat, did not raise her voice. She let the recording speak for itself, her silence amplifying its power. In that silence, her message was unmistakable. Dignity doesn't need volume when truth is this clear. The moderators glanced at one another, caught between disbelief and awe. One tried to interject, asking if the recording was authentic. Crockett's reply was simple. Yes, and I'm prepared to authenticate it under oath. The authority in her voice carried more weight than any defense Peterson might have offered. For the first time, Peterson looked small. The man who so often dominated stages with his wit and certainty seemed cornered, exposed. He opened his mouth to object, but the words faltered. His usual arsenal, sarcasm, intellectual jargon, rhetorical. Jabs was useless against his own recorded voice. The smirk that had so often disarmed opponents was gone, replaced by the tightness of someone scrambling for footing that no longer existed. The audience sensed it, and the shift was electric. Where moments earlier Peterson's supporters had cheered, now many sat in stunned silence, unwilling to defend what they had just heard. Crockett, meanwhile, radiated a quiet strength. She had not only defended herself, she had inverted the attack, transforming the insult of unfit into a weapon of accountability that left Peterson visibly shaken. The atmosphere in the room was no longer one of debate, but of reckoning. Every pair of eyes was fixed on Peterson, waiting to see if he could recover, waiting to see if his intellect could rescue him from the raw power of his own contradictions. He tried. He cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, and leaned into the microphone. "Out of context," he muttered. "This is misleading." But Crockett's calm reply cut through. "Your words don't need context. They speak for themselves." The line landed with the weight of finality. The audience broke into applause, a swell of approval that filled the space with sound. It wasn't just Crockett's supporters anymore. It was people across the spectrum realizing they had just witnessed arrogance give way to truth. On social media, the reaction was explosive. Clips of Peterson squirming went viral before the debate even ended. Commentators rushed to weigh in. Memes sprouted within minutes, capturing the look on his face as his own words dismantled him. And through it all, Crockett remained steady, her composure contrasting sharply with his unraveling. It was not just a counterattack, it was a mic-drop moment that would be replayed, shared, and remembered. In a single move, Crockett had shifted the narrative. She was no longer the target of insult. She was the truth-bearer, the fighter who had come armed not with anger, but with evidence. And as Peterson struggled to regain composure, the nation watched a dynamic reverse itself in real time. The man who prided himself on dismantling others had just been dismantled, not with fury, but with calm. The applause grew louder, spreading like a wave. Crockett did not smile, did not bask in the moment. She simply sat back, eyes forward, letting the echo of her counterstrike fill the silence. But the shockwaves didn't end in that room. The moment the recording ended, the world outside that auditorium ignited. What began as a murmur of gasps in the room surged into a tidal wave online, breaking across timelines and feeds with unstoppable force. Within minutes, hashtags bloomed, like wildfire. Crockett clapback, Peterson exposed, receipts ready. Millions who hadn't even watched the debate live suddenly knew exactly what had happened. Their screens filled with the face of Jordan Peterson, caught mid-stammer, and Jasmine Crockett sitting steady as stone. Clips of the exchange spread at lightning speed. TikTok users stitched Peterson's contradictions with ironic music, turning his words into memes. Twitter, still buzzing from earlier insults, shifted entirely, its outrage crystallizing into celebration. Instagram Reels replayed the moment. Crockett pressed play, setting it to slow motion as captions flashed, "This is how you fight back." Journalists moved quickly, their headlines unmistakable in tone. Crockett stuns Peterson with viral takedown. The night truth outshined arrogance. Mic drop heard across America. Late-night hosts seized on the footage, playing the recording to laughter and applause from studio audiences who delighted in the rare sight of a cultural giant shrinking under the weight of his own words. And then came the flood of voices, the influencers, activists, and celebrities who saw in Crockett's composure something larger than one debate. A pop star with 80 million followers posted, "Dignity is the ultimate power move. Jasmine Crockett, you're a queen." An NBA player shared the clip with the caption, "This is how you hold people accountable, even political rivals." Of Crockett couldn't deny the impact. One admitted on live television, whether you agree with her or not, that was a masterclass in how to handle an attack. What resonated wasn't just the exposure of Peterson's hypocrisy, it was the way Crockett delivered it, with precision, not fury, with receipts, not rhetoric. In an era when shouting matches too often defined politics, she had proven that truth, calmly wielded, could cut sharper than any insult. For millions watching, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. A black woman from humble roots had just turned the tables on a man whose career thrived on belittling others. It wasn't just Crockett versus Peterson anymore. It was the underdog versus the establishment, dignity versus arrogance, lived struggle versus lofty detachment. And for once, the underdog had won in real time. Communities that had long felt dismissed or silenced saw themselves in her victory. Immigrants, young women, marginalized voices. They flooded comment sections with words of thanks, pride, and validation. "She spoke for all of us who've been called unfit," one user wrote. "She didn't yell. She didn't break. She showed the receipts." Another comment, shared tens of thousands of times. "When they come at you with insults, come back with truth. That's the Crockett way." The ripple effect reached into classrooms, churches, and dinner tables. Parents showed their daughters the clip as proof that strength doesn't mean shouting down an opponent. College students dissected it as a case study in power dynamics flipped on their head. Grassroots activists quoted her line, "Your words don't need context," as a rallying cry against those who had long spoken down to them. And through it all, Peterson's silence grew louder. His attempts to spin the moment as out of context fell flat in the avalanche of receipts replayed on every platform. For once, his trademark confidence couldn't rewrite the narrative. The story belonged to Crockett now. It was more than vindication, it was validation. Millions who had been waiting for someone to stand tall against arrogance felt as though they had just witnessed their champion. For them, Crockett's moment was not just about politics. It was about pride, about belonging, about finally seeing someone flip the script that so often cast them as unfit. The debate might have been scheduled as one of many in a crowded political season. But after that night, it was etched into memory as a turning point. A moment when the underdog didn't just survive the attack, She turned it into her greatest strength. And as the nation debated, Crockett turned the insult into something bigger. When the storm finally calmed, Jasmine Crockett rose with the kind of quiet gravity that carried more weight than any shouted word. She didn't gloat, didn't mock, didn't linger on the unraveling of her opponent. Instead, she lifted her voice in a tone steady and resolute, transforming the entire evening from spectacle into something far greater. "This isn't about me versus him," she began, her gaze sweeping across the audience, her words reaching beyond the walls of that room. "It's not about personalities. It's about respect, for truth, for justice, and for dignity." A hush fell. What she said was simple, but in its simplicity lay power. Viewers leaned in, not to see a fight, but to hear a reminder of what leadership could mean. Crockett continued, her cadence deliberate, each word carrying the resonance of lived struggle. "We don't move this country forward by tearing each other down," she said. "We don't create solutions by belittling voices that challenge us. Service is not about ego. It is not about who can shout the loudest or dominate the room. Service is about people, their needs, their hopes, their right to be heard with respect." In that moment, the room shifted. The debate was no longer framed as Peterson's aggression against Crockett's composure. It became something universal, something everyone could recognize, the eternal choice between division and unity, between arrogance and humility, between spectacle and service. She did not dwell on the insult that had launched the night. Instead, she transformed it into a mirror for the audience, forcing them to ask themselves what kind of leaders and what kind of citizens they wanted to be. "When we reduce each other to labels," Crockett declared, "we all lose. But when we listen, when we honor the truth, when we choose dignity over disdain, we rise. Together." Her words soared not because of their polish, but because of their authenticity. She wasn't reading a script, she was speaking a creed. And as she spoke, people saw not just a politician, but a reflection of their own better selves. Online, the clip was replayed not as a takedown, but as a turning point. Teachers showed it in classrooms as proof that integrity can withstand insult. Parents replayed it at dinner tables, pointing out that true strength lies not in volume, but in conviction. And young people, often told they were too emotional or unfit, found in her words a manifesto of hope. Crockett's calm in the storm became an anthem, not just a political moment, but a cultural one. Because in a world that often rewards arrogance, she reminded millions that humility still holds power. In a society fractured by division, she offered a glimpse of unity, and that is why, when the debate ended, people weren't just talking about Jordan Peterson's stumble or Crockett's sharp rebuttal. They were talking about what it meant to lead with dignity, to face insult with composure, to carry truth as a shield instead of a sword. It was more than politics. It was principle. More than a clash. It was a lesson. And that's why this moment will be remembered, not just for the clash, but for the lesson. Unfit. The word was meant to cut her down, to brand her as less, to make her small. But instead, it became the spark that set the stage for one of the most unforgettable reversals in modern debate. What Jordan Peterson hurled as an insult, Jasmine Crockett, transformed into fuel, proof that she was not only fit, but unstoppable. That night was never just about two voices colliding. It was about a bigger question. What do we reward in our leaders? Arrogance or dignity? Division or unity? Noise or truth? Crockett answered without shouting, without venom, without theatrics. She answered with composure, with evidence, with faith that truth still has power. And in doing so, she didn't just win a debate. She won the respect of millions who saw themselves reflected in her fight. People who have been underestimated, dismissed, or labeled unfit now carry her moment as a banner, a reminder that resilience speaks louder than ridicule. If this story resonated with you, if you felt that surge of pride, that breath of relief, that spark of hope, don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel, share this video, and be part of a movement that values dignity over disdain, justice over ego, and service over spectacle. Because the more we amplify these moments, the more we remind the world of what leadership can look like when it's rooted in truth. Because sometimes the quietest recordings echo the loudest truths.